This is Mark Carver, convicted of unaliving somebody from touch DNA, which was transferred from the cop shaking his hand when he was spoken to near the crime scene. The cop had transferred his DNA onto the victim's car and spent 10 years in prison. So we're going to do a read through of this article. If you would like a copy of this article for yourself, here is the link in chat. There it is right there. Mark Carver, all other North Carolina unaliving exonerations. State of North Carolina, County of Gaston, unaliving somebody, reported crime date 2008, convicted 2011, exonerated in 2022 for a life sentence. Contributing factors: false or misleading forensic evidence, perjury or false accusation, official misconduct, an inadequate legal defense. Did DNA evidence contribute to the exoneration? Yes. This could be an interesting read from the National Registry of Exonerations. Just before 1 p.m. on May 5th, 2008, a man and a woman on jet skis spotted the body of a woman next to a vehicle on the banks of Catawba River in Belmont, North Carolina. The man flagged down a nearby construction worker who dialed 911. Officers with the Belmont and Mount Holly police departments arrived at the scene and were able to identify the woman as 20-year-old Irina Yarmolenko, a student at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Yarmolenko's Saturn was at the water's edge, stuck on a tree stump with both doors open on the driver's side. The car was in neutral and the keys were outside the car on the ground. The engine wasn't running and the airbags hadn't deployed. Oh my gosh. YouTube. And the airbags hadn't deployed. Yarmolenko's body was next to the car with her feet pointing toward the water. Her hand appeared to be gripping a vine. An officer would later testify her clothes and body were wet, although this wasn't mentioned in any police reports. And her hand appeared to be gripping a vine. An autopsy performed the next day found that Yarmolenko had been three times apparently taken from her car: a black sweatshirt, drawstring, a blue ribbon that matched the ribbon on a bag in her car, and a bungee cord similar to another bungee cord found in the trunk. Investigators also found a half-eaten sandwich from Wendy's in the trunk that seemed out of place. Yarmolenko was a vegetarian. From interviews and surveillance videos, investigators were able to build a timeline of Yarmolenko's movements prior to her passing. Between 10 and 11 a.m., she had gone to the bank, to Goodwill, then to a coffee shop, before heading west and crossing the Catawba. At 11:07 a.m., a surveillance video at the Stowe family YMCA in Belmont appeared to capture her car entering and leaving the facility's parking lot, which was a few hundred yards from where her body was found. Wow. The footage wasn't clear enough to show who was driving the car or whether Yarmolenko was alone. Yarmolenko worked as a photographer at the student newspaper. An editor at the paper told police that Yarmolenko might have been trying to scout out locations to take photos of the nearby U.S. National Whitewater Center, which was on the other side of the river. About 2:15 p.m., an officer with the Mount Holly Police Department interviewed Mark Carver, who was fishing about 200 feet from where Yarmolenko and her car had been found. Carver said he and his cousin Neil Cassida had gotten to the fishing spot about 11 a.m. Carver said that at around noon, he and Cassida had heard something that sounded like a bulldozer scraping the ground. He gave the officer his contact information and Cassida's information, then shook hands with the officer and went to pick up his daughter. Carver returned to the river later that day. He said he had forgotten his fishing net. The officers wouldn't allow him to retrieve the item. Carver returned the next day, but the net was gone. The Belmont police towed Yarmolenko's car to a secure garage. The Gaston County Police Department processed the car for fingerprints on May 5th and May 7th. (2008). Carver gave a formal statement that was written down by Detective Lloyd Addis of the Mount Holly Police Department on May 5th, 2018, and provided more detail about what he had seen on the river. He mentioned the jet ski riders as well as another boater, and that he had heard the man on the jet ski tell the man in the boat to call 911. He said he didn't know someone had passed until he had heard about it on the news. This is, if you're just joining, this is about Mark Carver, a person that was convicted of unaliving somebody from Touch DNA, which was transferred from the cop shaking his hand when he was spoken to near the crime scene, and then his Touch DNA from shaking the officer's hand was then transferred onto the victim's car. And this man spent 10 years in prison before he was exonerated off of DNA. Now, this is... think about it. Come on. That's why people need to slow down when it's 100% guilty, everybody, because what if you were Mike Carver? What if you were Mark? I'm sorry. What if you were Mark Carver? Would you want somebody on the outside, like being Mark Carver? You know how he would have felt if he would have had all these people on YouTube screaming 100% guilty no matter what, because his DNA was at the scene. Shit happens, bro. That's why you always got to think about if it was you. Shit. Right here. Shout out Storm OZ. Appreciate you. So this is saying right here now, this is the story of the case. This is what took place. The guy was fishing with his cousin. Shook the officer's hand. The officer went to the vehicle, touched the vehicle. Boom. All of a sudden, he's convicted. When you only have 20 skills, there's 20 skin cells on a sheath. You have no victim's DNA in your car, your home, your office. Has anybody else, maybe when dudes getting arrested asking if somebody else was apprehended. Maybe it's not somebody that was a co-defendant. Maybe it's somebody that it was like, yo, I know I didn't do this shit. You didn't get somebody else? Yeah, this is going to be a highlight too, because who knows about this even? You know, we did a highlight about the 2007 acquittal. I never saw anybody talking about that. I've never even heard of this one. You know what I'm saying? And this shit's important. I don't understand it. The 2007 acquittal video. If people saw that more, like, come on. And then this right here. These are two, like, if these two read-throughs don't wake you the fuck up about what's going on in this Idaho4 case and what these two, the acquittal in this, y'all need to slow down on this 100% fucking guilty. What if this shit was you? Man. So this was just getting to the part where they were taking the car to a secure garage and they processed it for fingerprints on May 5th and May 7th of 2008. So Mark Carver gave a formal statement that was written down by Detective Lloyd Addis of the Mount Holly Police Department on May 5th, 2008, and provided more detail about what he had seen on the river. He mentioned the jet ski riders as well as another boater that he had heard the man on the jet ski tell the man in the boat to call 911. He said he didn't know someone had passed until he heard about it on the news. At the time of Yarmolenko's passing, Carver was 39 years old and retired on medical disability. He had 2 arrests but no convictions for acts of violence, including an indictment in 2007 where he accidentally shot and wounded his son while they were wrestling. Investigators interviewed Carver and Cassida several times. Their suspicions aroused by the men's statements that despite their proximity to the crime scene, they didn't hear anything. In July, the police swabbed the car and the items used to unalive Yarmolenko for DNA evidence. This evidence was sent to the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigations, SBI, crime lab in Raleigh, where it was compared against buccal swabs taken in October from Carver and Cassida. On December 2008, the lab reported that it had been able to obtain a partial DNA profile from a swabbing near the rear door on the driver's side. The profile consisted of a mixture of several DNA profiles, the lab report said, but the predominant profile matched Carver. These 2 article read-throughs, yo, if these don't wake you up, the lab also reported it had obtained 2 profiles from the passenger door armrest and door glass. These profiles, the lab said, matched Cassida. Police arrested Cassida and Carver on December 12, 2008, charging both men with the unaliving and felony conspiracy to commit unaliving. In 2010, the crime lab with the Richland County Sheriff's Department in Columbia, South Carolina, performed additional DNA testing on the items used to strike Yarmolenko. Carver and Cassida were excluded as contributors. The SBI labs testing had produced similar results. Cassida was to go to trial first, but he passed of a heart attack on October 10th, 2010, the day before his trial was to start. Wow. You don't think that was brought on from the shit that was coming? The stress? That's so sad to hear. Thank you, Yoli. I appreciate you so much. Little kitty kitty. Appreciate you. Wow. You don't think that was brought on by the day before the trial was supposed to start? The dude passed of a heart attack. Carver's trial in Gaston County Superior Court began on March 14th, 2011, so he sat for 3 years. Wow. He was represented by Brent Ratchford with co-counsel David Phillips, who had represented Cassida. The state based its case on Carver's proximity to the crime scene. The DNA evidence in a statement Carver made to investigators after his arrest, where he appeared to say he knew Yarmolenko's approximate size and height. What? Maybe because Addis testified about his interactions with Carter. He said that he wrote down Carver's statement on May 15th because Carver told him that he didn't read or write very well. At the time Addis testified, Carver wasn't a suspect, but he had other officers later made several trips to the Catawba where they stood at Carver's fishing spot and the point where Yarmolenko's car was found. A prosecutor asked Addis, now while standing at the particular fishing spot, are you able to hear noises from the location where the victim's body was discovered? Addis said yes. A prosecutor asked Addis, now while standing at the particular fishing spot, are you able to hear noises from the location where the victim... Yes. Then the prosecutor asked, how could he be sure... Sorry, I'm still sick. Then the prosecutor asked how he could be sure because Detective William Terry and I went down there and talking in a normal voice could hear from each other's location and toss small rocks into the water from each location and you could hear it easily. This is some bullshit. Terry also testified about the results of the sound experiment, confirming Addis's account. In addition, he told jurors about items found in Yarmolenko's truck, including a camera that required film. Terry said the camera counter showed 2 pictures had been taken, but there was no film in the camera. Dude, if this is not like some PCA shit, like, yeah, the white car. Thank you so much, Tara. Keep it up. Oh, thank you so much. That's the prickly pear working out. Thank you, Tara. And I'll get to all your comments here after the read through's done. The white car was here and here and here and here and here and here. Investigators, how many vehicles did you start off with when you started looking at the vehicle? We started off with 19 to 22,000 vehicles. Yeah, that's where we started. Oh, okay. You're starting off with 19 to 22,000 vehicles. But yet you got the white vehicle going here to 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 here. Give me a break. That's what this sounds like in this fucking... Yeah, we talked normal and we could all hear each other and stuff. And we were even tossing rocks down in the river. And yeah, we could hear everything. 100%. Absolutely. Yes. Let's just get all these little things and let's just... Some Nancy Grace shit, right? Nancy Grace was doing all this shit. I'm going to do some Nancy Grace shit. I'm going to take all these little chunks and just kind of put it together and form a little ball, right? Like you're making a snowball. You get little parts of the snow off the lawn. Getting it together, packing it up, getting it nice and rounded. A snowball. Get it real packed up real good. And plus, the camera's counter showed 2 pictures had been taken. But where's the film? Oh my gosh. Under cross-examination, Terry said he didn't know whether the camera worked and that he didn't know whether there were boats on the river or construction equipment operating when he and Addis listened for each other. See what I'm saying? Under cross-examination, they didn't know. They didn't know whether the camera worked. They didn't know if there were boats on the river or construction equipment operating. They didn't know. But yeah, we could hear each other. Yeah, 100%. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Terry also testified about statements Carver made on December 12th, 2008, after his arrest during an interview with Terry and FBI agent David Crow. What the hell happened today? You know what I mean? Ever since I woke up this morning, I felt like shit, and there's just shit coming out left and right today. And now this. If these 2 read-throughs don't wake you up, Idaho people that are 100% guilty, 100% guilty or not with BK, come on. Read them yourself. I put the links in the chat. Terry also testified about statements Carver made on December 12th, 2008, after his arrest. During an interview with Terry and FBI agent David Crow, who told Carver that he would be sent to death row if he didn't confess, Terry testified that Carver accurately described Yarmolenko as being a little girl and that Carver stood up to show the officers how tall she was. On cross-examination, Terry acknowledged that Carver also said he might have seen pictures of Yarmolenko on the TV. Wow, it's amazing what you find out with cross-examination. It's amazing what you find out with cross-examination. I can't wait to hear the cross-examination of all this shit in the Idaho4 trial, right? Terry was one of the first officers on the scene, and he testified about Yarmolenko's appearance. She was laying on her back with 3 things wrapped around. He said her body was wet, her clothing was wet, and it appeared her hair was wet as well. Detective Jim Workman, a crime scene technician with the Gaston County Police Department, testified that he was able to lift 13 fingerprints from Yarmolenko's car. He testified that only one of the prints was some of value. He was asked, question, were you able to compare it to any known samples? Answer, no, we were not. Question, so none of them were having enough ridge detail to actually be used for comparison purposes. A, that's correct. Question, answer. So question, so out of all the lifts that you lifted from the car, were you able to compare those prints to anyone? Answer, no, I was not. Question, you weren't even able to compare those fingerprints to, say, the defendant? Answer, no, I was not. Question, because they weren't of value? Answer, that's correct. Workman testified that he also analyzed fingerprints lifted from the car's interior by Detective J.D. Costner with the Mount Holly Police Department. Assistant District Attorney Stephanie Hamlin asked Workman, from looking at the lifts that Detective Costner provided, were any of them of value to be comparable to a known sample? No, they were not. On cross-examination, Workman was asked, of the 13 prints that you took out of the scene, that you took out there on the scene on May 5th, 2008, did you find Mark Carver's fingerprints anywhere out there? He responded, no, sir. On redirect, Workman again said he wasn't able to make any comparisons of the fingerprints. He was asked, so you have no idea whose fingerprints those were on the car? That's correct, he answered. Karen Winningham, a forensic scientist with the SBI, testified about her analysis of the DNA evidence collected by the sheriff's office in Gaston County. She testified that the evidence was so-called touch DNA, typically left after a person's touches a surface and leaves skin cells. Winningham testified that she was able to generate a partial profile from genetic material left above the driver's side rear door. Knife sheath? I found that it was consistent with a mixture, meaning there is more than one contributor, and the predominant profile matched to the DNA profile from Mark Carver, she said. Bryan Kohberger. Winningham testified that her statistical analysis said that swabbing from the pillar above the driver's side rear door is approximately 126 million times more likely to be observed from Mark Carver than it came from another unrelated individual in the North Carolina Caucasian population. She testified similarly about the evidence collected on the window and on a front door armrest, tying that material to Casada. Winningham testified that Carver couldn't be excluded as a contributor to genetic material found on the seatbelt button in the rear passenger seat. Could not be excluded. Winningham also testified about the genetic material found on the items used to unalive Yarmolenko. She testified that Carver and Casada were excluded as contributors to the genetic material found on the ribbon and the bungee cord, and that Yarmolenko was identified as a contributor to the ribbon and drawstring and couldn't be excluded as a contributor to the bungee cord. She also said there were unidentified contributors to the ribbon and the bungee cord. During cross-examination, Winningham said that she did not think the DNA attributed to Carver was a result of tertiary transfer, meaning that person A came in contact with person B's DNA and then person A deposited that DNA on another surface. I'm not saying that this is not possible, but it is not probable, she said. Coffee cup? Microphone stand? Said it plenty of times. After the state rested, Carver's attorney moved to dismiss the unaliving conspiracy charges. Phillips said there was no evidence that Carter had unalived Yarmolenko or that tied him to the crime weapons. He said the fact that Neil Casada may have touched one side of the car, Mark Carver touched the other. Did they touch it at the same time? Did one touch it at 11 and another person touch it at 1? Hey, Neil, go look down here. Look what I saw. That doesn't prove the crime or unaliving somebody, Your Honor. It proves that they may have touched, in the light most favorable to the state, they may have touched the car. What's the conspiracy? Assistant Director Attorney William Setzer said it was possible that Carver's and Casada's DNA had been washed away from the bindings after Yarmolenko was placed in the river and then drugged back. What the evidence did show is a very isolated place in a very short time period with two people there with their DNA present and near a recently unalived female. Judge Timothy Kincaid dismissed the conspiracy charge, but not the unaliving charge. Carver's attorney presented no witnesses in closing arguments. Stetzer finally put forth a motive for the unaliving. He told the jury he believed Yarmolenko took a photo of Carver and Casada doing something that they didn't want anybody to know about. The two men attacked her and then took film from the camera. The jury convicted Carver of first-degree unaliving on March 21st, 2011, and he was sentenced to life. And Carver appealed his conviction, arguing that Judge Kincaid erred in not dismissing the case based on insufficient evidence in a 2-1 decision. The North Carolina Court of Appeals affirmed the conviction on June 5th, 2012. The majority opinion said that the evidence against Carver was circumstantial but sufficient. The dissenting opinion by Justice Robert Hunter said that the touch DNA was less reliable than DNA testing using the red stuff or other bodily fluids. Hunter also said that touching a car was not evidence of committing a crime. There is no other evidence tying the defendant to the crime scene. As such, I cannot hold the substantial evidence of circumstances accompanies the defendant touch DNA on the victim's car to indicate such DNA could have only been left at the time the crime was committed, Hunter wrote. The North Carolina Center on Actual Innocence began representing Carver after the ruling. On December 8, 2016, Center attorneys Christine Mumma and Cheryl Sullivan filed a motion for appropriate relief asking that Carver be granted a new trial based on ineffective assistance of counsel and newly discovered evidence. The motion said that Ratchford and Phillips had failed to present evidence of Carver's intellectual limitations and that carpal tunnel syndrome that hindered his grip strength and made him physically incapable of committing the crime in the manner in which was perpetrated. Wow. And that's why he was on medical. Carpal tunnel syndrome that hindered his grip and strength made him physically incapable of committing the crime. It is also said that Ratchford had failed to present evidence contradicting the state's witnesses' testimony that sound traveled easily between Carver's location on the river and where Yarmolenko was found. Remember, they didn't even know if it was boats or construction equipment. The motion said that Ratchford had failed to adequately cross-examine Terry about Carver's interview and his description of Yarmolenko. The interview was videotaped, but it was Crow who made the first mention of Yarmolenko's height, telling Carver, "Let's go back to May when you were down there fishing at the lake, and you know why. I mean, the girl, your little girl, got unalived down there. Same day you were down there fishing. Your little girl." As part of discovery, Ratchford had been given a report that noted the camera's picture counter could be advanced even if there was no film in the camera, but he failed to ask Terry this question, which helped prosecutors put forth the theory that Carver and Cassida had unalived Yarmolenko over some photographs. Most importantly, the motion said Carver's defense team had failed to challenge the state on the touch DNA evidence. Ratchford had retained a DNA expert, but he did not call the expert to testify, and Ratchford would later say that the expert had told him the state's science was good. A year before the trial, a group known as the Scientific Working Group for DNA Analysis Methods published a paper on best practices for interpreting complex and incomplete DNA samples. If the SBI's lab had followed the working group's guidelines, according to a report included in the motion, the samples from the car and from Carver would have matched at only 2 points, and the results would have been reported as inconclusive. The motion said that although Carver's trial attorney essentially conceded that Carver touched the car, that was incorrect. Carver denied touching the car. The motion was later amended and included a claim that prosecutors had failed to turn over exculpatory evidence. A woman had told police in the early days of the investigation that she had seen a man running away from the river carrying a book bag and he was wet with sweat or water. The information wasn't provided to the defense. What? Wow, this was not provided to the defense? During an evidentiary hearing in April 2019 before Judge Christopher Bragg of Gaston County Superior Court, Dr. Mayor Nuruddin, who had written the report re-examining the state's DNA findings, testified that Winningham had also given improper statistics on the probability that it was Carver rather than someone else who contributed the DNA. What she referred to as random match probability was wrong, he said. That is completely contrary to what the statistics are supposed to convey. Nuruddin said the random match probability conveys how likely or what is the random chance of finding a particular profile in the random population without reference to the actual individual. Nuruddin also testified that he had the DNA from the vehicle had been analyzed using the SWGDAM recommendations for interpretation of mixtures. None of the DNA would have tied to Carver or Cassida. At the evidentiary hearing, Workman testified about the fingerprint comparisons, but now said Carver and Cassida's fingerprints had been excluded from the prints of value lifted at the crime scene. Question: so the prints were compared to Mark Carver, is that correct? Answer: yes. Question: was that information ever disclosed at trial to your knowledge? Answer: not to my knowledge. Question: was it disclosed through your testimony when you were asked? Answer: not to my testimony that I can remember, ma'am. Question: and a comparison was made to Mr. Carver and Mr. Cassida, is that correct? Answer: an examination of the prints were made and no identification was made. Question: so did those prints have value? Answer: apparently so. Yes, ma'am. This contradicted his trial testimony where he said he had been unable to use any of the lifted prints to compare against known samples. The motion said Ratchford had this information and should have corrected the false testimony, but the state bore the responsibility for presenting it to the jury. Wow. Separately, two new witnesses testified at the hearing. Brothers James and John Beatty lived near the river and drove over there on May 5th, 2008, after they saw a life-saving boat on the water. They found Carver at their fishing spot, and he didn't seem wet, disheveled, or flustered. James Beatty said that about a year later, he and his brother met Stetzer at the river. John stayed at the fishing spot. James and Stetzer went to where the car had been in an effort to determine what could be heard. He was hollering back up there, and we were hollering back at him, but we could not understand each other, James said. His brother also testified about this experiment. James Beatty was subpoenaed as a state's witness at the trial, but never testified. Carver's attorneys were unaware of this experiment. This stuff is so. These two read-throughs are so. Emily's. The other read-through, Ann Taylor's 2017 acquittal. It'll be connected to this one, and I'll have the description in chat. Like, this stuff is so eerily similar to frickin' Idaho4. Shout out Stormozy. The state's witness at the evidentiary hearing included a forensic scientist from the SBI lab who pushed back against Nuruddin's findings. Mackenzie DeHaan testified that the working group's 2010 report contained only guidelines, not regulations, and they have very specifically stated that they are not meant to be applied retroactively because you have to perform new validation studies in order to incorporate some of the changes. The analysis that Winningham performed was good DNA science at the time it was conducted based on the equipment and validation studies that the lab used, she said. Following the court hearing, Carver's attorneys again amended their motion for relief. It said the prosecutors had failed to disclose the evidence about the hearing test done by the Beattys. The Beatty's testimony at the hearing indicates that Mr. Stetzer knew at the time of the trial that the testimony from Detective Terry and Addis that they could hear each other talking in a normal voice was false, the motion said. Of course, they couldn't even understand each other. And they didn't even know if there were boats or construction equipment. I mean, come on. During the evidentiary hearing, that the defense also claimed the state misled the jury when police and prosecutors described Yarmolenko's body as wet, which allowed them to argue that Carver's DNA had been washed away. None of the police reports mentioned this fact. The amended motion said the Carver's trial attorney should have spotted this problem, but that the state bore responsibility for this misrepresentation. On June 5th, 2019, Judge Bragg granted Carver's motion for a new trial based on ineffective assistance of counsel and the new evidence contained in Nuruddin's report. He did not find that the state failed to turn over the exculpatory evidence or committed misconduct at a trial. In his ruling, Judge Bragg said that Carver's defense team had failed to investigate and obtain Carver's medical records and have him undergo a psychological evaluation, which would have revealed his physical and intellectual limitations. Evidence of Mr. Carver's intellectual disabilities would be relevant regarding statements he made during his questioning. By SBI Special Agent Crow, Bragg said. Most importantly, Bragg said that Carver's attorney failed to adequately prepare to challenge the state on the DNA evidence. His only consultation with experts was extremely limited, Bragg said, although the attorney wasn't required to investigate every possible defense. Bragg said he was required to not cede the ground so quickly. The DNA evidence in this case is linchpin and basis of Mr. Carver's conviction for first-degree unaliving. The state has argued strenuously and pointed out repeatedly that the SWGDAM 2010 report itself states the revised guidelines are not intended to be applied retroactively, Bragg said. However, the facts are that Mr. Carver is serving life in prison without parole based on the DNA match of the door panel, and the testing, analysis, and interpretation of that item is doubtful at best based on advances in the testing, analysis, and interpretation of DNA mixtures. Carver was released from prison on a $100,000 bond in June 11, 2019, and required to wear an ankle monitor. The state appealed Judge Bragg's ruling, but the North Carolina Court of Appeals dismissed the appeal on April 20th, 2021, writing that the state couldn't appeal a motion granting a new trial based on ineffective assistance of counsel. The North Carolina Supreme Court denied the state's petition for discretionary review. On November 1st, 2021, the next day, Carver's attorneys filed a motion to dismiss the case. A judge later set a hearing for August 16th, 2022. On August 12, 2022, Gaston County District Attorney Travis Page, who took office in 2021, dismissed the charges against Carver. Page's filing said, upon a retesting and re-examination of the physical evidence, there is no longer sufficient DNA evidence to support the charge. Carver celebrated the dismissal, removing the electronic monitor that he had worn around his ankle for the past 3 years. Mumma said in a statement, "We are appreciative of the professionalism shown by the district attorney Page since he took office last year. Justice has finally been served for Mark Carver and Neil Cassida. If all the evidence had been accurately presented to the jury at the time of Mark's trial, Mark would have never been convicted, and Mr. Cassida may have not passed away on the eve of his trial. Both men are innocent, as they always have proclaimed." Shout out to District Attorney Page for doing what you're supposed to do, sir or ma'am. But, sir, Travis, shout out to you. Damn. Wow. And that's what I'm saying. Neil Cassida passed away from a heart attack the day before his trial. Could this have been brought on from that? That's so sad. What an article. Again, here's the link. Wow. I know it was a big read through. Man, that was crazy. Man, if this stuff doesn't make you realize